The invitation to watch from home, a stark pronouncement from my father that the wedding was exclusively for blood relatives, settled deep within me. So I honoured his directive, sitting alone, my gaze fixed on the screen, a familiar sting of exclusion pricking at my soul. Yet, what unfolded before me transcended anything I could have ever conceived. The live stream, in a cruel twist of fate, froze precisely as pandemonium erupted. A bride's shriek echoed through the digital silence, followed by the violent crash of shattering glass. The idyllic wedding scene fractured into a million pieces in an instant. It was in that frozen frame that I saw him, Thomas, my fiancé, seated beside my father, looking utterly at ease, as if he belonged there. But this shocking sight wasn't the deepest cut. What I witnessed next would fundamentally reshape my perception of my family. It wasn't merely betrayal, it was a meticulously constructed deception, a lie destined to tear them asunder and obliterate everything they had built upon falsehoods. I had always been the outsider, the perpetually excluded one. However, the scene unfolding on that live stream was more than just another rejection of me. It was the dramatic unraveling of their meticulously curated world. Stay with me, for the subsequent revelations will undoubtedly leave you utterly speechless. My name is Rebecca Miller. I am 32 years old, a graphic designer by profession, and until quite recently, I believed I had come to terms with being overlooked and forgotten. I reside alone in a modest Chicago apartment, characterized by its creaky floorboards and a downstairs coffee shop where they anticipate my order before I even utter a word. My life is quiet, unassuming, and deliberately solitary. Or so I used to convince myself. I strived relentlessly to forge stability from the chaotic origins of my past. Nevertheless, some wounds are too profound for any amount of routine or accomplishment to mask. My narrative doesn't commence at my sister's wedding. It begins nearly 2 decades earlier, when I was a mere 14, the year everything irrevocably shifted. My parents' marriage had consistently been fraught with tension, but I never imagined my father would simply abandon us without a backward glance. He cast aside my mother and me as if shedding an unwanted skin, offering no warning, no apology. Instead, there was just a new woman, a new life, and an impenetrable silence. Her name was Stephanie. She was 15 years my father's junior, a woman of self-assurance, refinement, and a sharp intellect my mother never possessed. I distinctly recall glimpsing her once through the window of my father's car, her hair impeccably styled, her laughter light and unforced. She appeared to have stepped directly from the pages of a glossy magazine, the type of woman capable of making a man forget his past entirely. And, in many respects, that is precisely what she achieved. My father remarried swiftly, and with equal speed, I became a phantom in his new existence. Phone calls ceased. Holidays passed devoid of a card or even a text message. The rare occasions I did see him, always in a neutral setting every few years. He addressed me with the strained courtesy of someone speaking to a distant acquaintance. There was no warmth, no genuine interest in the person I was becoming. I stopped attempting to impress him. I stopped striving to earn what he had apparently decided I no longer deserved. Then came Natalie. Stephanie bore my half-sister a year after the wedding. From the online photographs I saw and the fragmented stories my grandmother reluctantly shared, Natalie appeared to embody everything my father could ever desire in a daughter: intelligent, attractive, accomplished. She played the piano, attended private school, and beamed brightly in every family photograph that conspicuously excluded me. While I toiled through night shifts to assist my mother with bills, Natalie enjoyed birthday celebrations complete with ponies and catered brunches. She didn't so much replace me as she utterly erased me. As I matured, I convinced myself that this was acceptable, that I didn't need them. I immersed myself in academics, then in my career, and subsequently in a meticulously constructed life that left no room for hurt. I stopped reaching out. I stopped hoping. And eventually, I stopped caring. Or so I believed. Then, I met Thomas. He possessed a quiet, steadfast charm, a tech professional with gentle eyes and a calming demeanor, the kind of man who truly listened when you spoke and remembered the minutest details. Our paths crossed at a networking event. I was presenting a rebranding project I had completed for a local nonprofit, while he was seeking design talent for his startup. We connected almost instantaneously. Within 6 months, we moved in together. It felt secure, like something I could finally depend on. Thomas rarely inquired about my family, understanding their distant nature, and he never pressed the issue. Initially, I appreciated this unspoken understanding, but as time progressed, the silence surrounding that part of my life grew heavier, lingering between us during quiet dinners and relaxed Sundays. I rationalized that perhaps this was for the best, that I had forged a new family, one I had deliberately chosen. Yet, every now and then, something would serve as a poignant reminder. A father and daughter laughing in the park, a wedding invitation in the mail from someone I barely knew, a voicemail from an old neighbor mentioning she had seen my dad, and he looked well. These fleeting moments chipped away at the formidable wall I had painstakingly built, but I always diligently patched it back up. I seldom spoke of my mother either. She passed away when I was 26, a victim of cancer that was both swift and merciless. My father did not attend the funeral. He did, however, send flowers, lilies, her least favourite. I distinctly recall standing there, reading the card signed Richard and Family, and wondering if he even knew she was allergic to them. After my mother's passing, it felt as though the last thread connecting me to him had finally snapped. I was truly alone, and for a considerable time, I convinced myself that this solitude was a strength. I didn't need them. I had my work, my apartment, and eventually, Thomas. But then the invitation arrived, an email from Natalie, formally, almost coldly addressed, and something within me shifted profoundly. She was getting married. It was to be a lavish affair at a private vineyard in upstate New York. The email included a note from my father. Due to limited space, we've decided to keep the guest list to immediate family only. You can watch from home via live stream. That single sentence did more than merely sting. It ripped open every wound I thought I had buried. For the first time in years, I wanted to be there. Not for him, not even for her, but for myself. I longed to assess my standing, to know if, after everything, I still held a place. So, I watched. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was merely curious, that it was just another wedding, and I was perfectly fine. But when the video froze and the screaming began, when glass shattered and faces contorted in panic, I saw something that irrevocably altered everything. Not just a mistake, not just a betrayal, but a secret, one I was never meant to uncover. And that was the precipice from which everything began to unravel. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning, nestled between a spam advertisement for vitamin supplements and a bank statement reminder I never bothered to read. The sender's name made my stomach clench even before I opened it. Natalie Williams, my half-sister, the one who had grown up in the house that had once been mine, the one who possessed everything I lacked. I hadn't heard from her in over a year, possibly longer. Even then, it had only been a forwarded Christmas e-card devoid of any personal message. And yet, here she was, in my inbox, her name glowing like a spectre from a world to which I no longer belonged. The subject line read, "Wedding live stream details." I stared at it for a moment, attempting to reconcile the peculiar pairing of words. I clicked it open. "Hi, Rebecca. Hope you're doing well. Just wanted to pass along the information for the live stream in case you'd like to join us virtually. We're keeping the in-person ceremony small, just close family. Thanks for understanding. Best, Natalie." Attached was a digital invitation, replete with vineyard-themed calligraphy and gold leaf accents. The names Natalie Grace Williams and Zachary Cole Anderson gracefully intertwined across the top in elegant looping fonts. Below that, in a smaller italicized note, due to limited capacity, the couple has chosen to include only immediate family members and blood relatives in the in-person celebration. Thank you for your support and love. And then, as if to twist the knife, a final forwarded message from my father himself. It was terse, efficient, and chillingly cold. Rebecca, you can watch from home. The wedding is for blood relatives only. Dad. I remained motionless for a long time. The cursor blinked at me, as if awaiting a response, as if I might type something in return. But there was nothing to say. What words could I possibly offer when the message had been so unequivocally clear? I closed my laptop and stood by the window. Outside, the world proceeded as usual. Cars passed, a dog barked across the street, and someone meticulously watered their plants on the balcony below. Ordinary sounds on an ordinary morning, but inside, my chest tightened with an extraordinary silence. I desperately wanted to believe it was about space, about logistics, that perhaps the venue genuinely couldn't accommodate more guests, that despite the hurt, it wasn't personal. But I knew better. My father was immensely wealthy. He could have rented an entire estate if he so desired. This wasn't about space. This was about exclusion. It was the tone that truly pierced me. Not just Natalie's passively polite wording, but my father's blunt dismissal. You can watch from home. As if that was some generous concession, as if I should express gratitude for the opportunity to observe from a distance. And then that phrase, blood relatives only. The words echoed in my mind like a cruel taunt. I was his daughter, his only biological child. Natalie was the hearth. And yet, here he was, drawing a line in the sand that placed me firmly on the outside. It made no sense, at least, not on the surface. But the more I pondered it, the more something else began to stir within me. This wasn't simply about family dynamics. This wasn't merely Stephanie pushing me out or Natalie desiring a streamlined guest list. No, this felt strategic, purposeful. My father had never been an outwardly warm man, but he was undeniably calculating. He never acted without a reason. And this felt like a move on a chessboard, a deliberate removal of a piece he no longer deemed necessary in play. The memory of that forwarded message burned in my mind. He hadn't even sent it directly. He had allowed Natalie to be the messenger, then added a note at the bottom, as if it were an afterthought. Not, we'd love to have you watch. Not, I'm sorry it has to be this way. Not even, hope you're well. Just cold, distant instruction. The more I reflected on the situation, the more questions arose within me. Why was he so insistent on keeping me at a distance? What was he aiming to manipulate? Was there something specific he wished to conceal from me? Or perhaps someone? I found myself instinctively scrolling through social media, partly out of habit and partly driven by a growing desire for answers. Natalie's engagement photos were ubiquitous. She, radiant in a white gown, shared a laugh with Zachary, who embodied the ideal American groom. My father featured prominently in several shots, beaming with paternal pride, his arm around her as if she were his cherished sole offspring. Stephanie, too, was ever present, perpetually flawless. Naturally, I was absent from these images. There was no acknowledgement of his other daughter. In their narrative, I simply ceased to exist, a reality that had persisted for a considerable time. But now, after years, I didn't merely feel forgotten, I felt erased. And erasure carried a distinct, deeper sting, one that gnawed at my very core, making me question whether I had ever truly mattered to them. I revisited the email, examining it once more. My initial impulse had been to discard it, to ignore the whole affair and continue with my life. Yet, something held me back. Perhaps it was pride, or curiosity, or simply the compelling need to understand why. I clicked the link. A new tab materialized, revealing a countdown timer for a live stream. 10 days. 10 days until Natalie's perfect day. 10 days until I was expected to observe from the periphery, feigning happiness through a screen as if that could ever suffice. I bookmarked the page. Whatever their rationale for excluding me, I was determined to uncover it. For this was more than just a wedding. It was a message, and I intended to decipher every nuance. The 10 days leading up to the wedding stretched on agonizingly, each one heavy with an inexplicable tension. Since opening that email, a subtle shift had occurred, not only in my perception of my family, but also in how I viewed the life I had constructed with Thomas. Initially, I attributed it to stress. The past was resurfacing, old wounds reopening, and I assumed I was simply more sensitive than usual. However, as I paid closer attention, I realized the transformation wasn't solely within me. Thomas was changing too. He had always been a steadfast, consistent presence, the kind of man who would inquire about my day even when his own had been worse, who remembered my preferred tea when I was unwell. But that version of him had gradually begun to recede. He seemed distracted, abrupt, constantly engrossed in his phone. Our conversations felt truncated, as if he were already halfway out the door. When I asked if everything was all right, he offered a quick smile and attributed it to work, a looming product launch, a round of financing to secure. Nothing out of the ordinary, he claimed, but I was intimately familiar with his rhythms, and this was an unfamiliar cadence. One evening, 4 days before the wedding, I overheard him on the phone in the living room while I was brushing my teeth. His voice was hushed, urgent, using the tone people adopt when they wish to avoid being overheard. I froze, toothbrush in hand, and listened. Initially, I could only catch a few fragmented phrases. "No, she doesn't know," he stated. A pause followed. "Yes, I'll be there early, before the rehearsal dinner." I was stunned. He wasn't supposed to be attending the wedding at all. At least, that's what he had led me to believe. He had feigned surprise and indignation when I showed him the email, even declaring he'd forego a friend's bachelor party out of solidarity. Yet, here he was, making plans to arrive before the rehearsal dinner. I rinsed my mouth and quietly moved into the hallway, positioning myself closer to the edge, where I could hear more clearly without being detected. The next voice I distinguished sent a chill down my spine. It was my father's. I couldn't discern every word, but I grasped enough. They were discussing property investments, a vineyard acquisition, and potential licensing for a hospitality expansion. My father was providing Thomas with figures, projections, and timelines. It was the kind of dialogue one would expect between long-standing business partners, not between a protective father and his daughter's boyfriend, and certainly not between two men who, as I had been told, barely knew each other. Thomas's voice lowered again. "She still thinks she's out of the loop because of the wedding stuff. She hasn't asked questions." My blood ran cold. I retreated silently, quick enough to create a physical barrier between myself and what I had just overheard. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't. I didn't even know what to say. My mind was racing in too many directions. What exactly was Thomas involved in with my father? How long had this been going on? And, more importantly, was I merely collateral in whatever this arrangement was? The following morning, he behaved as if nothing had transpired. He kissed me on the cheek, informed me he had back-to-back meetings, and left his coffee half-finished on the counter. I watched him leave, wondering if he had always been playing a role I hadn't noticed until now. If so, he had been exceptionally good at it. I tried to persuade myself that I was overreacting, that perhaps it was simply business. Perhaps my father had contacted Thomas independently, attempting to make amends in his own convoluted way. Yet, the more I replayed the conversation in my mind, the harder it was to accept. There had been a distinct familiarity in their voices, a confidence, and something else, a sense of control. I began to sift through my memories for anything I might have overlooked. Instances when Thomas had inquired about my family, or times he had subtly changed the subject when I brought up my childhood or my father. There had always been a certain detachment that I had dismissed as politeness, but now it felt deliberate, calculated. He never spoke ill of my father, nor did he encourage me to mend the relationship, but he also never pressured me to walk away. He simply occupied a neutral space, and I had filled in the rest with trust. That evening, I opened Thomas's laptop while he was in the shower. I hesitated at first. I had never before intruded on his personal belongings, but something inside me insisted that this wasn't about jealousy or paranoia. This was about something deeper, something corrupted. Most of his files were innocuous: client decks, code folders, pitch documents. However, tucked inside a folder labeled Archive was a file that immediately caught my eye. RW Holdings Preliminary Report. I opened it. Inside was a draft presentation complete with financial projections, land appraisals, and a slide featuring an image of the vineyard where Natalie's wedding was slated to occur. At the bottom, in small print, read, "Partnership between RW Holdings and T. Evans Ventures, pending post-event negotiation." T. Evans. Thomas Evans. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just business. This was a partnership, a meticulously crafted plan. And given the timing and language, it appeared the wedding itself was intertwined with the deal, seemingly leveraged as part of a grander strategy. I closed the laptop just as the water stopped running. When he emerged, towel wrapped around his waist, he smiled and asked if I wanted to order Thai or Italian for dinner. I replied that I wasn't hungry. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling like an outsider in my own existence. Whatever was unfolding between Thomas and my father, it was clearly not something I was meant to discover. And yet, there I was, precisely in the midst of it, uninvited to my sister's wedding, yet somehow integral to the very transaction that would follow it. The realization settled slowly, then all at once. I wasn't merely being excluded, I was being managed. The morning of the wedding arrived with an unsettling tranquility. Outside my apartment window, the city continued its usual rhythm: delivery trucks reversing into alleys, neighbours walking their dogs, children shouting as they raced past on bikes. But I seemed deaf to it all. The only sounds I could discern were the echoing memory of Thomas's voice from nights past, and the hollow thud of my own heartbeat as I opened my laptop. The wedding was scheduled to commence at noon, New York time. I clicked the link embedded in Natalie's email, and a video window opened on the screen, displaying a polished, still image of the vineyard estate where the ceremony would be held. A countdown timer ticked in the corner. 10 minutes. I stared at it, half expecting it to vanish, part of me hoping it would. I had barely spoken to Thomas that morning. He had left early, claiming he needed to grab coffee and clear his head. I didn't inquire about his destination. After the unsettling discoveries I'd made, his words held less significance than his absence. I watched the door close behind him, resisting the urge to follow. If he was going to the wedding, I would soon know. When the stream finally went live, soft classical music played as the camera slowly traversed manicured hedges, rows of pristine white chairs, and a floral arch overflowing with pink and ivory roses. A young man in a suit adjusted a microphone stand. Guests, clad in summer linens and pastel dresses, began to arrive, exchanging smiles, hugs, and air kisses. It was all so beautiful, so elegant, so meticulously staged. I scanned the crowd, my eyes darting over faces, searching for anyone, everyone I recognized. Stephanie was there, of course, positioned front and center in a lavender dress, her arm linked with that of a man I didn't know. She appeared serene, composed, every inch the gracious stepmother of the bride. But my father was nowhere to be seen. I leaned closer to the screen, wondering if I had simply missed him. Perhaps he was just outside the camera's frame, issuing instructions to staff or greeting latecomers. Yet, The minutes continued to tick by, and still no sign of him, no familiar silver hair, no tailored suit, no stoic expression attempting to appear joyful. And then I noticed that someone else was also missing. Thomas. My breath hitched in my chest. My eyes frantically darted from group to group, scanning with increasing urgency. He wasn't there. Not among the guests, not seated to the side, not even standing at the back attempting to be inconspicuous. If he had arrived early, as he claimed, where was he? The music shifted, Vivaldi now, louder, more majestic. The officiant stepped forward. Guests settled into their seats. A profound silence descended, pierced only by the whisper of chiffon and an infrequent cough. Then Natalie emerged, radiating beauty. Her dress sculpted her figure flawlessly, its lace train gracefully flowing behind her like a cascade. She offered a serene smile as she made her initial steps down the aisle, escorted by the same unfamiliar man who had accompanied Stephanie. Still, the father of the bride was conspicuously absent. I remained transfixed, watching my sister advance towards a future from which I felt utterly excluded, surrounded by individuals who had seemingly rewritten history without my presence. The officiant commenced the ceremony, his words weaving themes of love, family, and unity. I barely registered his speech. My gaze incessantly roamed the background, the periphery of the scene, searching for any flicker of movement, a glimpse of a familiar face. A crucial detail then caught my eye. Towards the rear, just beyond the rows of seated guests, a man stood clutching a tablet. He wasn't recording, he was observing. His attention was fixed on the crowd, not the couple. He wore a black earpiece and intermittently spoke into a microphone affixed to his collar. Perhaps he was security, or maybe purity. But what purpose would private security serve at a wedding of this nature? A knot formed in my stomach. Something felt undeniably wrong. As the ceremony progressed, the camera angle subtly shifted. Zachary appeared anxious, yet genuinely happy. Natalie gazed up at him, radiant with anticipation. The officiant spoke of lifelong commitment, of solemn vows, honesty and truth. I almost let out a cynical laugh. Truth. It was in such short supply here. Then, something peculiar occurred. The camera glitched. Not merely a delay, but a distinct stutter, a hiccup in the stream. The video skipped a second, then two. Natalie's head turned mid-smile, as if her name had been called. The image then froze. No sound, no motion, just a static shot of my sister, half-turned, her smile beginning to falter. I waited, my heart pounding, fixed on the unmoving screen. I refreshed the page, but nothing. I checked my internet connection. It was stable. My cursor hovered over the tab, as if its presence might somehow reanimate the feed. But it did not. And that silence, a digital kind, reminiscent of a blackout, resonated more profoundly than any scream. They were all there. My family, my boyfriend, my sister. And I wasn't just left out. I was deliberately being kept in the dark. For a brief moment, everything remained still. The screen had frozen on Natalie's face, half-turned, her expression transitioning from joy to something I couldn't quite identify. The audio had ceased entirely. No violins, no vows, just an oppressive quiet. I, too, sat frozen, staring at the screen, imploring it to restart, to flicker, to do anything. Then, it did. The video abruptly resumed. No fade, no warning, just a sudden flicker, and instantly the perspective had shifted. It was now a wide shot from the back of the aisle, encompassing the entire gathering from behind. The bride and groom were no longer visible, but the guests remained, some still seated, others standing, all craning their necks towards something just out of frame. And then I saw him. Thomas, seated in the third row, flanked by my father, Stephanie, and two unfamiliar men. His head was turned slightly, as if having just exchanged words with the woman beside him. He laughed. He appeared relaxed, at ease, as though he belonged. He was supposed to be in Chicago. He had left the apartment that morning in jeans and a hoodie. No suitcase, no suit, no mention of a flight, a drive, or any plans. He'd simply said he was stepping out for coffee. Yet, there he was, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, a perfectly knotted tie, and neatly combed hair. Not a trace of hesitation in his posture, no guilt, no anxiety, just an air of comfort. The image lingered for no more than 3 seconds before the screen plunged back into blackness. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, unsure if I had truly witnessed what I believed I had. I refreshed the stream. Nothing. I reopened the page in a new tab. Still blank. I consulted the event's social media account. Comments were already accumulating. Anyone else lose the feed? What's going on? It just cut out right when things were getting good. But I no longer cared about the bride or the ceremony. I wasn't watching for the champagne toast or the floral arrangements. I had been watching to catch a glimpse of what I had been excluded from. And what I saw felt like a blade piercing my ribs. It wasn't just that Thomas was there. It was where he was sitting, in the family section, 3 rows from the front beside my father, as if they had always been allies, as if I hadn't been living with a man who had spent months feigning indifference about a wedding he was now apparently celebrating. He was one of them. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly keenly aware of the chill in my apartment, the low hum of the refrigerator behind me, the quiet tick of the clock, the stillness of the air. It all pressed in, heavy and suffocating. This was a different kind of silence. Not from a frozen live stream, but from the slow, agonizing realization of betrayal. I attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps he had a last-minute change of plans. Perhaps he simply wanted to offer support. Perhaps he thought I wouldn't mind. But the lies unraveled faster than I could mend them. If it were innocent, why hide it? Why lie about Chicago? Why sneak out? Why take a seat next to the very people who had pushed me away? And most painfully, why did he look so utterly at home? My phone buzzed, a text from an old college friend I hadn't communicated with in months. "Hey, random, I think I just saw Thomas at a wedding live stream on Facebook. Someone shared it. Thought he was out of town." The screen blurred. I realized I was trembling. It was all true. He had acted behind my back. He had lied, and he had done so not with reluctance, but with comfort, as if this deceit had been ongoing for longer than I could fathom. What wounded me most deeply wasn't merely Thomas's attendance. It was that everyone there had allowed it. My father, Stephanie, Natalie. They all knew I wouldn't be present. They knew I would be observing from a distance, powerless. They knew that by keeping me at bay, they could control what I perceived. But they hadn't accounted for the camera angle shifting. They hadn't counted on my eyes catching his. They hadn't counted on me seeing what they had worked so diligently to conceal. In that single, frozen frame, everything coalesced. The distance, the peculiar phone calls, the cryptic business discussions, the forwarded wedding email, the deal I was never supposed to know existed. I didn't yet grasp the full extent of their shared secret, but now I was certain they were hiding it together, and I would no longer remain silent. The image of Thomas beside my father at Natalie's wedding endlessly replayed in my mind. I couldn't stop it. I barely slept that night, my thoughts spiraling, each darker than the last. I tried to convince myself there had to be an explanation, but explanations require truth, and truth had become a scarce commodity in my world. By morning, I wasn't angry. I was clear. Clarity is a peculiar gift after betrayal. It sharpens every perception. I knew I couldn't trust what Thomas had told me. I couldn't trust what my father had shown me. But I could still trust what people chose to post online. People inevitably reveal more than they intend to. I opened my laptop and began with the obvious. Natalie's social media accounts. She was meticulous, curated, the type of person who edited every caption and filtered every image. Her Instagram was a pristine gallery of her perfect life. Brunches, bridal showers, soft lighting. I meticulously scanned post after post, delving not just into the images, but also the tags, comments, and timestamps. 3 weeks before the wedding, there it was, a photograph of Natalie at a wine tasting. She stood beside Stephanie, both smiling, holding glasses of white wine. In the background, blurred but unmistakably clear, was Thomas. My breath hitched. He wasn't tagged. She hadn't mentioned him in the caption. But it was him. Shoulders slightly turned, one hand in his pocket, sunglasses pushed up onto his head. He had told me he was in Denver that weekend for a startup conference. He had even forwarded me a flight confirmation. I checked my calendar to verify the dates. It was indeed the same weekend. I continued scrolling. Another post, 2 days later. This time, a selfie Natalie had taken with Stephanie in front of a white stucco building. In the reflection of the window behind them, a man was stepping out of a black car. Again, Thomas. I moved on to Stephanie's page. Hers was less public, but a few tagged photos from friends were accessible. One from a fundraising gala dated 6 weeks prior. Stephanie stood within a group of sharply dressed attendees. My father was not in the shot, but Thomas was standing near the edge, drink in hand, conversing with a man I recognized from a press release on my father's real estate firm's website. The caption read, "Big moves ahead for RW Holdings." Thomas had been at the gala, a gala I hadn't even known existed. I pulled up my search history and opened the RW Holdings website. It was sleek, minimalist, excessively polished, just like my father. I browsed the team bios. Thomas's name was absent, no mention of him as a partner, advisor, or consultant. But when I navigated to the investor section and delved deeper, I found a link at the bottom of a press release labeled Affiliate Ventures. I clicked. There it was, buried within a paragraph. TE Ventures to advise on upcoming vineyard redevelopment proposal in partnership with RW Holdings, effective post-Q3. TE Ventures, Thomas Evans. Everything clicked into place all at once. The vineyard wasn't just a wedding venue. It was part of a broader financial strategy, a front for something more significant. My father's company had likely acquired the land, or was in the process of doing so, and Thomas, operating under his own venture, was involved in the advisory process. And none of them had told me, not Thomas, not my father, not even Natalie. I leaned back in my chair, utterly stunned. How long had this charade been unfolding? For how many years had they systematically excluded me, offering fragmented data only when it served their agendas? I had spent ages under the misconception that I had simply been forgotten. Yet, this wasn't mere oversight. It was a deliberate, tactical omission. My gaze lingered on Thomas's features in the photographs, that effortless smile, that comfortable demeanor. He, too, had executed his role with perfection. I reflected on the countless evenings he had claimed exhaustion from meetings, the sudden, last-minute business trips, and his frequent suggestions that I avoid discussing family at dinner, asserting it only heightened my distress. He hadn't been shielding me. He had been safeguarding himself. The full scope of his betrayal, entwined with whatever transaction he was facilitating for my father, now felt vast, less a singular injury, and more an intricate web into which I had inadvertently stumbled. They were all complicit, grinning and shaking hands, while I remained an unseen observer behind a screen. My exclusion wasn't limited to a wedding. I had been locked out of something far more substantial, something involving finances, properties, and possibly even an inheritance. And Thomas, the individual I had trusted implicitly, had been an accomplice throughout. I rose and paced my apartment, my heart thumping. I needed more evidence, more clarifications. Confrontation was premature until I possessed the complete narrative, until I could engage in a discussion armed with irrefutable facts that they couldn't manipulate. I launched a private browser window and initiated a search for real estate records within New York State. Transaction permit filings, vineyard acquisitions, anything that could link my father's enterprise to the land where the wedding had occurred, or establish Thomas's documented involvement. I had the names, I had the chronology. Now, my task was to unearth what they had diligently concealed. Whatever intricate structure they were erecting, I would not permit them to complete it without scrutinizing every single brick. And if they presumed the daughter they had erased would remain silent, they were about to discover the full extent of my voice. Thomas arrived home later than usual that evening, a plastic bag of takeout in hand, his face betraying no hint of anything amiss. That alone almost propelled me over the edge. His facile ability to deceive, to seamlessly revert to normalcy as if nothing catastrophic had transpired, was a capacity I hadn't realized he possessed. He placed the package on the kitchen counter and glanced at me, stiffly seated on the couch. "I got that spicy chicken you like?" he offered. I remained silent. He turned. "Rebecca." I met his gaze and, without raising my voice, inquired, "How long have you been working for my father?" His expression didn't falter, not immediately. A subtle downturn at the corner of his mouth, the briefest catch in his breath. That was all I needed. He slowly set the bag down. "I was going to tell you." I stood up. "When? Before or after you sat beside him at my sister's wedding and smiled for the camera?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck, a characteristic gesture when cornered. This time, however, I wouldn't permit him to extricate himself. "Just tell me the truth," I insisted. "I deserve that much." He nodded slowly. "It began after your mum passed away. Your dad, he was concerned about you. Said you were drifting away. You distanced yourself, stopped taking calls. He feared you might spiral." I stared at him, my voice now sharp. "So he dispatched you to monitor me, as if I were a project." "He didn't phrase it like that," Thomas countered, suddenly defensive. "He introduced us, orchestrated our meeting at that gallery opening. I didn't initially recognize who you were, but once I found out, yes, he asked me to keep an eye on you, to ensure you were all right." I took a step back. "And the relationship? Was that part of the assignment too?" His silence confirmed everything. I let out a short, bitter laugh. "How long were you planning to sustain this? Until the deal closed? Until you collected your payment?" "It wasn't like that, Rebecca." His voice cracked slightly. "Initially, it was strange, yes, but I truly fell for you. I swear I did." I shook my head. "So you simply neglected to mention that my father was compensating you while you slept in my bed. You forgot to disclose that our entire relationship was constructed on surveillance and manipulation." He attempted to approach, but I raised a hand. "Don't!" He halted. "The vineyard," I continued, "the redevelopment, the fabricated investor meetings. Was I merely the conduit between the family name and your financial gain?" He didn't respond immediately. Then, softly, "The family aimed to consolidate assets. Your dad believed keeping you close would streamline matters. If your name featured in the paperwork, if complications arose, he would possess leverage, legal recourse." "So, I wasn't just being watched," I stated. "I was being positioned, utilized." He cast his gaze downward. I sank back onto the couch. Not from weakness, but because the sheer weight of it all made standing feel suddenly absurd. Every conversation we had ever shared, every weekend spent together, every kiss, none of it felt untainted anymore. It was all intertwined with this grotesque arrangement, this meticulously constructed lie I had mistaken for love. "My mother despised him," I murmured softly. I never understood why. I thought it was about the affair. But now, I comprehend. She recognized his capabilities. She saw what he would do to safeguard his image, his influence. And now, Now I am merely another transaction in his portfolio. I didn't want it to conclude this way, Thomas offered. It began this way, I retorted. He remained silent thereafter. He stood there for a period, perhaps hoping the appropriate words would eventually materialize, but no words remained that could rectify any of it. I looked at him one last time, unsure of whom I was even observing. Not my partner, not my confidant, but simply another man who viewed me as an instrument, a means to an end. And for the first time, I grasped the meaning of being erased from one's own life, not forgotten, but rewritten. I did not weep after Thomas departed. I did not scream. I no longer even felt the searing heat of anger. What settled within me that night was something colder, quieter, and an unshakable resolve. I had been deceived, exploited, and manipulated like a mere pawn in someone else's game, but I would not remain in that role, not anymore. I commenced my investigation the following morning, not with vengeance in mind, but with newfound clarity. I needed answers, genuine answers, not filtered through Thomas's explanations or concealed within boardroom presentations. I began where I knew it would impact them most: money. My father's company, RW Holdings, had always been somewhat enigmatic to me. A real estate conglomerate, yes, but its specifics were vague at best. I delved into publicly accessible documents, state filings, property acquisitions, and tax disclosures. A distinct pattern began to emerge: properties acquired at inflated values and subsequently sold via shell companies, vineyard and resort developments sharing common addresses, and licensing agreements that suspiciously involved Thomas's venture firm, TE Ventures, at remarkably opportune intervals. More than once I encountered obstacles: documents designated as private deals that seemed to vanish mid-year, companies that existed solely for a single transaction before disappearing. This was not disorganization. It was deliberate, a labyrinth crafted to confuse, to mislead, and I had lived my entire adult life oblivious to the walls that encircled me. It was around that time that I remembered Maria. Maria Vega had been my mother's dearest friend for many years. I recalled her warm laugh, her rich accent, her quick wit, and the quiet sorrow in her eyes at my mother's funeral. After that, we lost touch. My father never mentioned her, and at the time, neither did I. But now I speculated that if anyone had perceived what I had missed, it would be her. I located her number through an old contact in my mother's alumni network and called without hesitation. When she answered, there was a prolonged pause after I introduced myself. "Rebecca," she said gently, "you sound like your mother." Those 5 words nearly devastated me. We met that afternoon in a secluded cafe outside of town. Maria looked older, of course, but no less astute. Her eyes softened as she observed me. I didn't need to elaborate much, simply stating that I had questions about my mother, my family, and what had been kept from me. Maria didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and produced a thick, yellowed folder. "Your grandmother trusted me," she explained. "She asked me to keep these in case your father tried something." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, land deeds, account statements, trust documents, and at the very top, a will, with a handwritten codicil attached, in my grandmother's cursive. It read, "In the event of my passing, Rebecca Miller shall retain full control of the estate, unless she is proven mentally or legally unfit." I stared at the words. This wasn't merely paperwork. It was protection. My grandmother had ensured I would inherit her estate, her vineyard, her accounts, everything. And somehow, none of it had ever reached me. Maria elucidated what she knew. After my grandmother's passing when I was 19, my father had assumed control as executor. He had presented an altered version of the will, one that designated him as the primary trustee. With my mother gone and me away at school, there had been no one to challenge him. He claimed I wanted no part of the estate, that I had waived my rights. He forged my signature. My hands trembled as I sifted through the pages. Some bore notations in my grandmother's handwriting. Some featured witness stamps from an attorney Maria remembered meeting. These were authentic, original copies, never submitted to probate. My inheritance had been stolen from me, my life rewritten, first emotionally, then financially. And Thomas, he had known that the redevelopment of the vineyard, the very location of Natalie's wedding, was part of my inheritance. It had been surreptitiously taken from me, presented as a family gathering, then transformed into a profitable business transaction. And the man I cherished had stood in full support with the person who dispossessed me. This wasn't merely treachery, it was outright fraud. I turned to Maria. "Can this legally succeed?" She responded with a nod. "If you act quickly and if you're prepared for a confrontation." I was no longer seeking merely a position at the negotiation table. I was determined to dismantle the entire framework. I didn't schedule an appointment, nor did I notify them in advance. That morning, I strode directly through the glass doors of RW Holdings as if I owned the establishment, because, in a sense, I did. Or at least, I was about to demonstrate that I rightfully should have. The receptionist barely acknowledged my presence as I passed. The elevator doors opened as if anticipating my arrival. Floor 28, the executive level. His office was located at the corridor's end, as it had been for years. Yet, I had never entered it with such resolve before. I had never arrived with righteousness on my side. When the door swung open, my father was seated behind his mahogany desk, typing an email. He looked up, first surprised, then clearly irritated. "Rebecca," he uttered, attempting to infuse warmth into his voice. "What brings you here?" I closed the door behind me. "We need to speak." He gestured towards a chair opposite him. "If this concerns the wedding, it doesn't." I placed the folder on his desk, the very same folder Maria had given me days prior. It landed with a heavy impact, and I observed the fleeting flicker in his eyes. Recognition, then fear. "What is this?" he inquired, despite already knowing. "Everything you tried to keep from me," I stated. "The genuine will, the property records, the trust documents, Grandma's handwritten codicil." He didn't open the folder. He didn't need to. I continued. "You were fully aware of her intentions. You knew Mother wanted me to inherit everything, and you knew I would never consent to selling or restructuring the estate. That's why you concealed it from me. That's why you falsified my signature. You've been laundering assets through TE Ventures, using Thomas as a frontman. And now you've packaged it all into a vineyard deal masquerading as a wedding." He offered no denial. He leaned back, his hands clasped before him, and for an extended moment he remained silent. Then, calmly, he asked, "How much do you want?" It took me a moment to grasp the implication of his words. "I'm offering you a settlement," he clarified. "A generous one. You walk away, and I'll have the papers prepared. You won't have to worry about anything for the rest of your life." I stared at him. "You stole everything from me, and you believe I'm here to negotiate?" "It's not about negotiation, Rebecca. It's about moving forward." "I'm not the one who needs to move forward," I replied. "I'm the one you abandoned." The door opened behind me. I turned to see Stephanie entering, perfectly composed, a silk scarf draped around her neck as if this were merely another charity luncheon. "Well," she began, "I presume the truth is now exposed." "I know what you did," I declared. "I know you persuaded him to suppress the will. I know you told him my mother never trusted me, that I couldn't handle responsibility." Stephanie tilted her head, an amused expression on her face. "Your mother was sentimental. She believed only blood made someone worthy." I disagreed. "You mean she thought I was her daughter, and you wanted to ensure I paid for that?" She offered a faint smile. "You were always a problem, Rebecca. Not loud, not theatrical, just inconvenient. And frankly, I thought Thomas would be enough to keep you quiet. My hands clenched at my sides. You thought incorrectly. My father stood up. Rebecca, listen to me. This doesn't have to become unpleasant. It already is, I retorted. He approached me. You're my daughter. No, I countered. I'm your liability. They thought I had come to bargain. They still hadn't grasped the situation. I'm not walking away, I informed them. I'm going to court. I'm going to the press if necessary. You fabricated legal documents. You buried my inheritance. You used my partner to spy on me. This ends now. Stephanie's carefully constructed facade finally fractured. You destroy your own family. You destroyed it, I responded. I'm simply shedding light on the truth. I left them standing amidst the rubble of the deceit they had constructed. For years I had perceived myself as an outsider within my own family, but now I understood the reality. They hadn't pushed me away. They had been attempting to erase me entirely. Yet I was still here, and my silence was definitively over. I filed the lawsuit on a Tuesday. There was no dramatic courtroom scene yet, merely a meticulously prepared stack of documents delivered to the county clerk's office by my attorney, Linda Hayes, a sharp, quietly formidable woman who showed no hesitation when I revealed my father's name. She examined the files Maria had provided and remarked, "He's going to regret underestimating you." By Friday, a formal complaint had been lodged with the state's Office of Legal Affairs. By Monday, the press had caught wind of the story. It began with smaller local finance blogs and a regional news outlet. However, the narrative was simply too compelling to overlook. Daughter of real estate mogul accuses father of financial fraud, forgery, and inheritance theft. Names like RW Holdings and TE Ventures began appearing in headlines. I didn't need to elaborate much. The facts spoke for themselves. My father, a man who had built his reputation on principles of legacy, structure, and ethical business, was suddenly associated with fraud. And this was more than just a media nightmare. It was a legal one. The original will from my grandmother, the property transfers, the falsified signature, it was sufficient to trigger a formal audit by the state's Financial Crimes Unit. But the true shock came 2 weeks later. Linda called me, her voice unusually strained. "You should sit down." RW Holdings had lost 3 of its largest investors. The departures were quiet, without public statements, but the message was unequivocally clear. They were severing ties. The 4th and 5th investors exited days later, including major banks and a private capital firm that had collaborated with my father for over a decade. One of them anonymously leaked their rationale to the media. "We cannot sustain a partnership with an organization under serious legal scrutiny involving allegations of financial misconduct, forgery, and misrepresentation of inheritance claims." That statement resonated more deeply than I had anticipated. It wasn't just that they were withdrawing, it was that they were declaring, without apology, that my account was credible. Behind the scenes, the situation only deteriorated for him. Internal emails were subpoenaed. Several deals he had made with shell companies were traced back to entities co-managed by Thomas, who had since become unresponsive, no longer answering texts or emails. The RW Holdings Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting. Rumors circulated about his removal, about the impending collapse. Stephanie, of course, remained publicly silent, but a leaked voicemail from her to a former family friend circulated online. Her voice was sharp and panicked, blaming Richard for his carelessness and for allowing the girl to delve too deeply. The girl. That's what I had always been to them. A girl they could exclude from the wedding. A girl they could use to legitimize a deal. A girl they could silence with a check. They hadn't recognized me as a threat until it was irrevocably too late. But the most agonizing part wasn't witnessing my father's empire tremble. It was watching him feign indifference. I saw him once during the initial fallout, crossing the lobby of RW's building, Sunglasses on, suit immaculate, yet his gait had changed. He moved more slowly. He was constantly looking over his shoulder. The man who once commanded everything was now desperately trying to reassemble the fragments of a narrative he no longer controlled. Meanwhile, I received messages from individuals I hadn't spoken to in years. An old college colleague saw the news. "Good for you." A former assistant of my father's wrote, "We always suspected something was amiss." Even a journalist reached out. "If you ever wish to tell your story in your own words, we'll provide the platform." But I wasn't pursuing headlines. I wasn't even doing it for revenge anymore. I was doing it to reclaim something that had always been rightfully mine. Not just the land or the assets, but my name, my voice, my place. Because when you've been erased by people who claim to love you, the most radical act you can perform is to prove you were always present. And now the world was finally beginning to see it. When the news broke concerning Thomas, it didn't commence with an explosion. It began with a leak. A whistleblower, anonymous but later speculated to be a disgruntled former associate, transmitted a trove of internal emails, financial statements, and draft contracts to several prominent media outlets. Within hours, what had previously been mere speculation became undeniable fact. The documents corroborated everything: false reporting, undisclosed holdings, cross-collateralized debts concealed beneath shell entities, and fabricated beneficiary transfers. At the nucleus of it all was Thomas Evans. His name appeared on every crucial document: joint advisor roles with RW Holdings, forged asset valuations, and internal memorandums recommending the preemptive silencing of potential inheritance claims. He was not a mere bystander. He was a central perpetrator. Within 24 hours of the leak, every remaining contract under TE Ventures was frozen. Partner firms issued statements disassociating themselves. Investors demanded audits. His face vanished from company websites, his LinkedIn profile scrubbed, and his social media accounts locked. A popular finance blog ran the headline, "The Golden Boy Who Gambled It All and Lost." But it was more severe than a fall from grace. It was utter annihilation. Thomas released a statement, bland, legally worded, mentioning regret, cooperation, and the truth emerging in due course. But no one paid heed. His prolonged silence had spoken too loudly, and now the public had turned against him. However, it wasn't solely about Thomas. In the subsequent wave of repercussions, further documents surfaced. Emails exchanged between Stephanie and Richard, flagged by auditors now meticulously scrutinizing RW Holdings systems. One in particular garnered significant attention. Dated 2 years prior, it read, "She'll never comprehend what this family truly requires. She was her mother's weakness, not ours. The sooner we obliterate the old woman's intentions, the better." Stephanie. The trust stuff. Dad said he'd handle it. She'll watch from the sidelines like always. Rebecca sidelines. This sentiment resonated negatively with the global public. Abruptly, Natalie's countenance ceased to symbolize a bride. It became a sneer, juxtaposed with headlines such as "Sister of Silence" and "When Blood Isn't Family." Her husband's burgeoning startup experienced a 10% decline in valuation within a week, following social media campaigns urging investors to reconsider backing a family implicated in scandal. Public empathy had shifted. Not for Richard, not for Stephanie, not for Natalie, but for me. I had never sought that public attention. I never desired it. But now that it was there, I wielded it judiciously. I granted one interview, just a singular one. A recorded segment for a national morning television program. I articulated the truth plainly. I did not weep. I did not hurl accusations. I simply elucidated what actions had been taken and the choices I had subsequently made. That measured restraint amplified its potency. Hundreds of viewers contacted the show. The program's inbox overflowed with emails, not solely from women, but from men, parents, adult children. individuals who had experienced disinheritance, disrespect, or dismissal. People who understood the profound meaning of being erased and the immense effort required to reclaim one's own narrative. For every setback my family encountered, I advanced a little further, not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound inner peace. I felt no compulsion to celebrate Thomas's downfall. I didn't need to witness Stephanie's name expunged from every gala invitation. I didn't need to observe Natalie's public image disintegrate. What I genuinely required, and what I finally possessed, was the truth. It was unveiled, unshakable, incontrovertible. It was definitively mine. 6 months later, the court rendered its judgment in my favor. The original will was upheld. The fabricated documents were declared null and void. My grandmother's estate, long obscured by false claims and deceitful maneuvers, was restored to its rightful heir, to me. I was granted full ownership of the vineyard, the family land, and the liquid assets my father had concealed behind shell companies and fictitious trusts. However, when the judge pronounced the verdict, I did not experience a surge of triumph. I felt an immense sense of clarity. It wasn't about the money. It had never truly been solely about the money. It was about being heard, being seen, being acknowledged, not as a burden or an inconvenience, but as someone who held significance, someone who had always mattered, even if they had attempted to obliterate my existence. Once the news was officially confirmed, I did not convene a press conference. I refrained from posting anything online. Instead, I returned home, prepared a cup of tea, and sat in tranquil silence. Not because I felt empty, but because for the first time in an extended period, I felt complete, filled with a peace I could undeniably trust. That newfound peace, however, brought with it profound clarity, as I recognized I was not alone. My story had ignited a spark. Since the interview aired, I had received a deluge of messages and letters from individuals who had been excluded from wills, discredited by stepfamilies, or manipulated into relinquishing everything by people they had mistakenly trusted. They sought not only to congratulate me, but also to solicit help. And I realized, with a powerful certainty, that I could provide it. I allocated a portion of the settlement to establish something my family could never have conceived, a non-profit legal fund exclusively dedicated to supporting individuals disinherited from their family's inheritance due to manipulation, abuse, or fraud. I christened it, Our initial clients approached us quietly, a woman in her 60s whose father's will had been altered by her brother during his hospital stay, a man whose grandmother's estate had been absorbed by a religious cult his uncle had joined, a young woman who, much like myself, had been told she wasn't family enough. They all arrived carrying the same expression I had once borne, the look of someone striving desperately to reaffirm their existence, and we assiduously helped them achieve precisely that. Meanwhile, my father's empire crumbled incrementally. Legal fees escalated. His name, once synonymous with reliability in real estate circles, transformed into a cautionary narrative. Stephanie quietly divorced him, offering no public statement. Natalie relocated out of state, avoiding reporters and former acquaintances alike. They were left with each other, for whatever meagre comfort that offered now. A family constructed upon deceit possessed nothing to bind it together once the falsehoods disintegrated. But I was no longer observing them. I had taken up residence in the vineyard house. It was neither grand nor overtly modern, but it radiated tranquility. The porch overlooked the sprawling fields, and the ancient oak trees continued their delicate whispering as the wind swept through them, just as they had done during my childhood, a time when I still believed the concept of family was something inherently unbreakable. Now I understood better. Family is not determined by shared blood. It is defined by who safeguards your reputation when you are absent. It is about who believes your narrative before it is substantiated. It is about who remains when everything else crumbles away. I was no longer isolated. I had constructed something of genuine significance. I had meticulously rewritten my own story, not as a casualty, not as the forgotten daughter, but as a woman who rose to the occasion when it truly mattered. I didn't require a surname to define my worth. I had forged something greater. And somewhere, deep within the serene hush of that vineyard, I could almost discern my mother's voice once more. She wasn't uttering, "I'm proud of you." She was affirming, "I always knew." And finally, so did I. If you have journeyed to the conclusion of Rebecca's narrative, we extend our gratitude for accompanying her through each betrayal, every unforeseen turn, and each step towards justice. Stories like hers transcend mere fiction. They embody the anguish, the unspoken silences, and the profound resilience that many carry, yet rarely articulate. If this account resonated with you, or if you have ever felt marginalized, overlooked, or purposefully erased by those who should have offered protection, we earnestly invite your perspective. Share your reflections in the comments. In Rebecca's shoes, what actions would you have taken? Do you believe genuine forgiveness is attainable following such a profound betrayal? And if you seek more narratives that unveil the stark realities concealed behind flawless family portraits, showcasing how perseverance can meticulously rewrite an ending, ensure you subscribe. Each week, we deliver compelling tales of justice, accountability, and strength that you will not encounter elsewhere. Ensure your narrative resonates within this collective, as certain accounts are truly worthy of complete and thorough attention.